Hi BookTube and welcome to a new video. This is a sort of wrap up of books for the last 3-4 weeks. It's been a bit slower progress than normal because I've been finishing off a novel of my own, which I'm glad to say I submitted today. So hopefully I'll get back on track in terms of wrap up videos about once every fortnight or so. But consequently, there's quite a few books to get through. So the first one is Selva, Almada, Not a River, translated by Annie McDermott from the Spanish. Selva Almada is Argentinian and was on the shortlist for the International Booker Prize for this very book. Marguerite Duras, The Ravishing of Stein, translated by Richard Seaver. Two collections of poetry by the same poet, Joyelle McSweeney, Toxicon and Arachne, and Death Styles, which is the one that's just come out. Georges Borges, The Aleph, short stories, translated by Andrew Hurley. Blue Lard by Vladimir Sorokin, translated from the Russian by Max Lawton. Denis Johnson, Nobody Move, what a fabulous cover that is. And In Defence of the Act by Effie Black. And one piece of non-fiction, or one non-fiction work, Viktor E. Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning. I assume this was written in English and not translated. Part 1, which I haven't read, I'll explain more about that in a minute, translated by Ilse Lash, and Part 2 I assume was not translated, he wrote it in English. Anyway, that'll be the last book I'll be talking about. So I'm going to start with Selva Almada, Not a River. As I say, this was on the shortlist for the International Booker Prize, my first Almada book, and I think she's coming to London to talk soon. I have to say I was slightly underwhelmed by this book. It crosses the similar territory to the Brazilian writer Ana Paula Maia, who wrote the wonderful Of Cattle and Men, or I think that was the title. I'll post a link to my review of it. And also she wrote a book published by Dalkey Archive called Saga of the Brutes. And both writers concentrate in these books on sort of working class, poverty-ridden, in this case Argentina, in Maia's case Brazil. This is set in the countryside by a river where 3 men, or 2 men and one of their sons, come into an area to go fishing, so they're not from the area, and they catch this huge stingray and they sort of tie it up between the branches of trees, so it's just sort of hanging there. And they're visited by the locals, who are sort of quite impressed by the catch, but very suspicious of them as outsiders. And in the end, these guys don't know what to do with this ray, and it starts obviously decaying and putrefying, so they just sort of dump it back in the river. And when the locals find out about this, they go mad. They see it as a sort of almost like an incursion, a raid, a despoiling of their home area by outsiders, and that sort of builds up into a climax. And it's told very simply, the language is very simple. There are 1 or 2 wonderful images involving birds flying off from trees having been disturbed, but it just didn't do a lot for me. And I actually got confused because it does jump around in time between the present and the near present, but that doesn't leave much of a gap in terms of the characters being at different ages between the 2 time scales. And I actually got very confused at one point. I mean, I worked it out by the end, but that also sort of influenced my enjoyment of the book. I couldn't quite figure out that these characters who were supposed to be dead appeared to be alive in the present. Yeah, so I mean, you know, perfectly well written. I gave it 3 stars. And on to Marguerite Duras, The Ravishing of Stein. It's one of her earlier books, and one I found sort of curiously affecting, really. So Stein has a best friend called Tatiana, and they're at a dance. Stein's there with the love of her life, a man called Michael Richardson, and this older woman walks in with her daughter, and Richardson ends up dancing with her on the dance floor, and they walk out of the hall, and Stein realises that she's just been dumped, basically. This other woman has usurped her and stolen her man from her, and she has a nervous breakdown, effectively. And her life is initially spent almost sort of comatose, but then on a walk outside of her house, which is what she uses to sort of slowly recuperate and re-enter the world, this man called James Bedford, I don't know why all the characters have English names, but they do, he wants to save her, and they end up getting married, and she does. She manages to rebuild some sort of life for herself, family life, with children. She doesn't leave the house. She doesn't really interact with the world other than taking these long, long walks. But she sort of has a realisation that she wants to get back in touch with Tatiana, tracks her down, makes up a sort of excuse to sort of suggest that she's not a stalker. And we enter the realm of a sort of a ménage à trois, or a proto-ménage à trois, where it gets really interesting, because the writing just crackles and fizzles with tension as, you know, will Stein take away Tatiana's long-term boyfriend, or maybe even be a husband, I can't remember, from her, or this voice that we discover about halfway through has been the narrative eye, the narrator eye. So there's been this eye voice observing Stein from a distance, and it's never clear who this voice is until, as I say, about halfway through. And the second half gets really interesting. As I say, it's very taut, it's very tense, it's full of both sexual and non-sexual tension, and that's where it sort of gets into the realm of being a ménage à trois. And I just thought it was really, really good. I can't remember if I gave it 4 or 5 stars. I think I gave it 4 stars. And on to the 2 collections of poetry, Toxicon and Arachne, and Death Styles. And I have to say, I love Toxicon and Arachne. It's one of those, she's one of those poets who just throws out these sort of word detonations that sort of explode with rich imagery and sonance and sort of words you wouldn't expect to be sort of put together, but they do, and in doing so, as I say, they sort of blossom and explode. Wonderful stuff, until you get to the last section, which is called Arachne. And the reason that I struggled with that sort of fed into the reason behind Death Styles, because unfortunately Joyelle McSweeney lost a child after 13 days. She had 2 or 3 other children, but a newborn only lasted 13 days. And the whole of this book is, or this collection, is trying to process grief through writing, and in a very specific way, which I'll come on to in a minute. And the Arachne section is about that grief. So I assume the child died during the sort of writing of this, and the last section of Arachne was after the death of the child. And not unsurprisingly, because it's a work of grief, it's less ebullient and playful in terms of its language, and that's totally understandable. Didn't affect my overall sort of enjoyment of this collection, so I gave this 5 stars. This, on the other hand, I found far less effective. She says in the back, in sort of as afterword, that as part of her process of both grieving but also coming back into the world, she set herself the discipline of writing a poem every day. She had to use a prompt of something that she rubbed up against during the day, a household object or something she saw outside, and that they were unplanned, that she would keep writing the poem until it just sort of finished, came to a natural end, or run out of gas even. And the problem with all of this is it reads like that. It reads like poetry that hasn't been planned, that hasn't been worked on and worked on and worked on and revised, and different word choices substituted for, and I think it suffers for that. So although it's entirely understandable, and it's a bit churlish to sort of criticise a poet who's sort of working through the loss of a child, I did think this poetry collection suffered for basically being sort of instant response. It felt like a writing discipline, it felt like a writing exercise, rather than anything a bit more profound. So I gave this 3 stars. And on to the Aleph by Borges. So I read Borges with Stina over at Beating Around the Books last year or a couple of years ago, and we loved it, absolutely loved it. And she was over visiting in London last year, and we were in bookshops obviously, and this was on offer. So she already owned it, but she persuaded me to buy a copy. And I have to say, this is far inferior to Fictions, I feel. In that the joy of Fictions is it was so sort of inventive, that even though when it was sort of dabbling back into recent history in Latin America, it was still forcing you to think about the nature of fiction, hence the title, literature, texts. It was very playful on that sort of textual level. There's very little of that here. What we get here, much more centre stage, is the history stuff. The sort of history of revolutionary Argentina, revolutionary Uruguay. And I found that the story is far less taxing, far less imaginative, and far less fulfilling, really. So I gave it 3 stars. Now, on to Blue Lard by Vladimir Sorokin. So this is one of those books where you just have to go with it. Don't try and work out what the hell's going on, what it all means, what the references are. Just sort of, you know, as if you're jumping into a swimming pool, as if this book is a swimming pool and you're diving into it. And just go. Now, if you're not prepared to do that, this isn't the book for you. So part 1 takes place in the future, where it's some sort of scientific lab come mining facility somewhere in deepest Russia, but the slang is sort of infused with Chinese words, and there's actually a glossary of that in the back. There's also a glossary of the scientific technical terms, but they're gibberish. They're absolute gibberish. They're never explained what all these scientific terms are. They're just translated effectively. So it's tough going in the beginning, but if you can get through that, I think there's enough in here to reward the reader, again, without ever really being able to put it all together in a coherent whole. I mean, he's flung everything into this book. There are lots of sacred cows that he takes aim at, because the joy of the first part in this sort of lab is that there are clones of 8 of Russia's most famous writers. And these clones are producing texts in the style of, and what Sorokin does is produce original texts, but in the style of. So we get people like Chekhov, Platonov. So the Chekhov is in the form of a play. So I'm just seeing if there's an index for me to get all the authors. No, so I'm going to have to. There's the poetry of, what is her name? Akhmatova. Who else do we get? That's Chekhov. Tolstoy we get. We get Pasternak. But the aim in this lab is to produce sort of literature, or reproduce literature, or generate new literature in sort of old styles. In the act of producing these texts, these clones produce a blue lard, the blue lard in the title, which is what they're really looking to mine, because this blue lard has some extraordinary powers, although it's never really clear what these powers are. So that section, once you got into these 8 texts, was glorious, really enjoyable, if you sort of ignored the confusion that led up to it in terms of sort of setting the scene of this lab and all this sort of Chinese Russian stuff. But a raid is staged on the lab, and everyone in it is killed, and the blue lard is stolen. And there's sort of time travelling. It's a time travelling pirate raid back to the 1950s, but it's an alternative 1950s in which Hitler and Stalin are still ruling over their countries. They've got a pact which has meant that London has been demolished by nuclear bombs. America is the joint enemy, is still holding out. And this blue lard is presumably key to some sort of weapon to establish world dominance, although again, it's not really clear. And there's a very, very enjoyable for me section, I just like the humour of this, whereby the blue lard, once it's come back from the future, is passed from person to person to person in this sort of chain of hierarchy, I suppose, in terms of, well, who's it finally going to end up with? You know, I just found it very funny the way that these different people and their different ranks and their different areas of control was sort of explained by Sorokin. It just tickled me. I enjoyed it. But then we get to the Hitler and specifically the Stalin sections, because the blue lard is initially delivered up to Stalin, and eventually he goes and has a meeting with Hitler. And I found the Hitler-Stalin sections a bit more, not baffling, but I couldn't quite see the point behind them, because they were both alternative. You know, not the Hitler as we would recognise him, not the Stalin as we would recognise him. So presumably there was some point in depicting them how they were depicted, but I couldn't get it. I didn't really understand. And then it becomes a sort of power struggle over the possession of the blue lard between Hitler and Stalin. So it started on a low because you didn't know what was going on. Then it went to extreme high with the replication of these classic Russian authors. Then it stayed at a high because of this sort of mad chain of sort of custody of the blue lard, which I just found very funny. And then it went down again because of the Hitler-Stalin stuff, which I just didn't really get with. So overall, I think I gave it 4, but it's closer to 3.5. You've got to stick with it. You've got to commit to this book, I think, if you're going to get anything out of it. And on to Denis Johnson, Nobody Move, a sort of gangster novel, fast-moving, very enjoyable, very light, sort of treads similar territory to some of the works of Cormac McCarthy, though presumably without the spiritual stuff that McCarthy dabbles in. But enjoyable for all of that. But I will say, to me, there's two types of Denis Johnson novels. There's these fast-moving ones, such as this, such as Angels, such as Resuscitation of the Hanged Man, and even the stories of Jesus' Son. But then there's the slow Johnson, like Tree of Smoke, Fiscadoro, which I do not enjoy at all. But the weird thing is that in a lot of what I call the fast-moving novels, the characters are waiting around. So, for example, in this book, the sort of act that sparks and incites all the action is one man shoots another man in the thigh because he believes that the other guy is going to kill him. So it's sort of self-defence. And then the guy's been shot in the thigh, because they're all criminals. He is sort of whisked away to a nurse to basically look after his shot leg. He can't really do anything initially because his leg's shattered. And the other guy, of course, is laying low because he knows the rest of the criminal gang will come after him. So it's fast-moving, despite the fact that the two main protagonists are laying low, immobile, which I think is quite an interesting dynamic that he sets up. And there's a lot of characters sort of lounging around doing nothing. So, for example, The Stars at Noon, there's a lot of that going on in the heat of Nicaragua. Resuscitation of the Hanged Man is, again, a man who's sort of on the run, but not criminally, but because his own life is falling apart, and he's going to this place in order to end his life. But it's called Resuscitation of the Hanged Man because, you know, he has a road to Damascus conversion, decides he wants to live. So there's a lot of, it's a weird dynamic. And the exception is Jesus' Son by Denis Johnson, which is a slow, meditative novel, but it's a very short novel. It's just over 100 pages. So although it's slow moving, because it's short, actually, you get through it quickly. And for me, this is my favourite, sorry, did I say not Jesus' Son? Train Dreams. Sorry, I'm talking absolute nonsense. This book is, 114 pages long. So although it's very slow and contemplative, because it's so short, actually, it has its own pace that you get to take you through it, to conduct you through it. And this is my favourite Johnson novel of all time, of the ones I've read. I mean, I've read quite a few. And it's the exception to the rule because it's a slow novel of his that I really enjoyed, whereas Tree of Smoke, I did not enjoy at all, and I just found very, very slow. Anyway, so going back to the novel I'm talking about, Nobody Move, I gave 4 stars. Good fun. Now, In Defence of the Act by Effie Black. this starts off in a really intriguing way, whereby someone who studies insects sees an item on a sort of TV program talking about suicide, and she has a fantasy, or she imagines herself inserted into the conversation between the show host and the expert talking about suicide, to give the contrary opinion that actually maybe suicide isn't such a bad thing in some cases, that it's actually an altruistic act by the person committing suicide to remove themselves from the world in order to save other people, the quality of their life or whatever. And as a study academic in the insect world, she offers various examples, such as the honeybee. I think it's the honeybee. Anyway, one of the species of bee. Of course, when a bee stings, its tail remains embedded in the victim, and that kills it, and that makes it die. But she's saying that's a form of suicide that is to the greater good, to save the hive. And she gives other examples. And I thought that was a really interesting setup and scenario of the whole book. And then she talks about two people who are very dear to her who both committed suicide, and is trying to work out, or do those cases fit her own thesis that not all suicide is necessarily a bad thing. The first one is her roommate at college, housemate at college. They are very, very close. And she's shocked because he has committed suicide. And she then finds out that actually he was a really bad guy. He was sort of sexually abusive and a stalker. Not to her, but to someone else. She doesn't believe it. And she starts almost stalking the victim, the female victim, and realises, no, it was true. Therefore, an evil person who can't control their impulses, killing themselves, may be a good thing for society. And the other one is she realises that she's a lesbian, but it sort of comes from quite a sort of sheltered background, but is lucky enough to befriend an older lesbian couple who've become her sort of mentors. They sort of introduce her to clubs and sort of meeting spaces and things like that. And she's really, really close to them. Unfortunately, one of them had an eating disorder, which when she first met her was not in evidence that she had it under control. But unfortunately it reasserts itself and eventually carries off her life, this eating disorder. So again, she's thinking about, whether this could be said to be saving her partner, because her partner knew about this. And rather than have a whole lifetime together of this sort of ups and downs of when the woman was in the thrall of the eating disorder or not, maybe actually spare. And her last words to the protagonist of this is, make sure she gets back into life, i.e. make sure she finds another partner, that she's releasing her partner back into the world by taking herself out of it. So far so good, but then we get a lot of biographical stuff. Now, whether this is based on Effie Black's life or not, I've absolutely no idea. But I found that a lot less engaging, because she sort of slightly had moved off her theme of suicide. And it just became a sort of personal reportage of the main character, the things that happened in her life and stuff. She herself, I don't think, ever feels suicidal at any stage, even when things aren't going well for her. But then we finish up with another suicide. So this is the third suicide of someone close in her life. I mean, she's a real Jonah in that respect, unfortunately. I don't mean to make light of it. And that person is her sister, who was terribly screwed up, and again seemed to be on the track to sort of recovery and sort of well-being, but in the end removed herself from life because she herself felt that she was a screw-up and everyone will be better off. So the book by the end has returned to its theme, but it was that soggy middle bit that sort of knocked a star off for me, because I just didn't really feel that it sort of fit in with how the book had started in such a wonderful sort of thought-provoking way. So I gave it 4 stars. And finally, on to Viktor E. Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. So this is a book in 2 parts. The first part is Frankl talking about his time in a concentration camp during the war, where he noted that the people who managed somehow to think outside of their own immediate sphere. I mean, obviously in a concentration camp with no food, no warmth, and seeing people carted off to be killed there's a lot to narrow one's focus into that. But he's saying that people who manage to sort of think beyond that, either by helping other people, worse off than even they, so maybe sort of finding some food for them, or giving them food, or tending for them when they were sick, whatever it is. Or in his own case, he had all this stuff that he wanted to write about, and he just kept, because he had no access to pen and paper, he just kept playing them over and over in his head to remember them. So that people who were driven like that, who were driven to a purpose beyond their immediate circumstances, he said, generally fared much better and had more chances of survival in the camp than those that didn't. Now, I didn't read that part one. This is just from the blurb and understanding. The reason I picked this book up is for part two, because it's called Man's Search for Meaning. Because Viktor Frankl after the war, was a therapist and who wrote papers and books on his form of therapy, which was a form of existential therapy for searching for meaning in life. So if you think about it, so the original psychotherapy, Sigmund Freud, was all about being driven by one's desires, both conscious and unconscious. So the pleasure principle. I mean, there was a lot more to Freud than that, but essentially, let's call it, the will to pleasure. Then you had Nietzsche, who was not a therapist, although he himself went mad, who talked about the will to power. So the will to pleasure is an individual. Every individual on earth is driven by it, according to Freud. Whereas Nietzsche was saying, no, we're not driven as individuals solely within the context of our own needs. We're driven by what he called the will to power, which is obviously a societal thing, because only a few people can hold power at the top of society. So it gone from the individual, the subjective in a way, to the wider community with Nietzsche and the will to power. Frankl's was a third way, called the will to meaning, which sort of returns it back to the individual, where his therapy was, if you're suffering existential doubt and it's affecting your life, the quality of your life, you have to work through and find out what the meaning of your life, not everybody else's, not one philosophy, not the answer of 42 from the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy is the meaning of life. No, what it means for you. And that is his form of therapy. And that's the reason I picked this book up, because the book that I've just finished deals with the will to pleasure, the will to power, and the will to meaning. And I'm curious, because I don't know the answer to this. I have had existential therapy, although it's specifically the sort of discussing death, the prospect of death and mortality. So existential therapy, there's lots of different branches of it. So I'm curious if the search for meaning, the branch of existentialist therapy that deals with that, is that still practiced? Is that still a body of thought and discipline that contemporary existentialist therapists pursue? If anyone knows, if they can let me know in the show notes, I'd be really grateful. I'm just curious. I mean, it doesn't sort of tie into anything. What I've written is what I've written. It's not a therapeutic setting, my novel. But anyway, so it's a bit hard to rate this book because I've only read half of it, but the half I read was, interesting stuff, 4 stars. So there you have it. As I say, I should be back on track really for reading. In July, I plan to buddy read with one of my subscribers, Bob Black, Solenoid by Mircea Cartarescu. I've got Clarice Lispector's not the name of the apple. I forgot what it's called. The Something and the Apple, or the Apple in the Something, which is a long book for her. It's 400 pages. Normally she's sort of around the 150-page mark. That will be my next read. What else have I got to read? But that's sort of my immediate prospects. So although I'll be back on track, I'm reading 2 quite big books, which will again slow down the rate of me doing videos. But anyway, these are books that I've really been wanting to get to, and I couldn't commit to them while I was writing my novel. I do have another novel to get back to, but I'm giving myself a couple of months off over the summer. I shall just be reading and catching up on life. And I won't get back to that novel till probably maybe August, but definitely September. I mean, today we've just announced that Britain is finally going to have a general election. So that's going to be interesting over the next 6 weeks. I predict it will be a very, very ugly election, as no doubt will the next American election if it's between Trump and Biden. But anyway, so there you have it. That is my latest recent reads. Thank you very much. Till next time.